So one of the first things we're going to talk about are the communication models of communications. And one thing I want you to recognize is that communication can open and close doors. So then you have to sit back and say, am I an effective communicator? My brother is a chemist, and one of the former companies that he had been with downsized, as a lot of companies have done in some of the harder economic times. And there were a couple hundred people from business who were let go. So, there aren't a lot of places that are just lookmists, and we have a tendency to think, well, they're just sitting in an office, they're just, back there looking through microscopes, and so being able to communicate just really doesn't matter. But such was really not the case. As my brother was out searching for jobs, of course, he filled in applications and he sent in resumes. And then the current company that hired him is an internationally known company, and he does travel internationally for them. But part of the process for him to gain this job was he did the resumes and he did the conversations over the phone, and then he was flown in and he had some face-to-face meetings with some of the higher ups within the corporation and the company. And one of the final things he had to do was an oral presentation about how he would be able to impact that company. So even chemists, and he had to do a PowerPoint presentation with it, because the better communicator you are, the more effective you are out in the world, or in your church, or in your workplace. But understanding communication is just key. So let's talk about a couple things along that line. Let me ask you this. Is there really a difference between informative speaking and persuasive speaking? Now, sometimes we have an immediate response. Oh, absolutely, Mrs. Morris, because when I was in high school speech class or when I was in college speech class, I had to differentiate. I had, informative speaking assignments, and then I had a persuasive speaking assignment. And so, yes, indeed, there is just really this complete and total difference. But let me ask you this. Isn't it true that simply by the nature of what is presented, or by nature of the fact of what is left out, we are persuasively communicating? Isn't it true that we see that an awful lot when we're dealing with political issues? Isn't it true that news media are oftentimes the gatekeepers to the communication that we receive? Now, news, by nature of what it is supposedly, inherently objective, right? They're supposed to just present the facts, and then we're supposed to sit there and watch and or listen or read, and then we'll sift through. But I think the more we progress as a society, the more our news media have really become persuasive through their own venues. Let me give you an example. Do you remember Gitmo? And then there was the big uprising on should America keep Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, or should it be closed down? And of course, when it came to the closing of it, there were big, big issues about, recognize this picture? This is what's known as waterboarding. And that's when you give the individual who's on the board, who's laying down, the impression of drowning. So there's some pouring of some water upon that person, and then hopefully through this process, it's the desire of the interrogators that the person will give up information, which then will help that side. Now, whether or not you agree with that as a form of trying to extract information from people, this really became a news media just a firebomb for them. And they began presenting it, and some of the sides, some of the um, news organizations, such as Fox News, would come out and say, hey, this is totally legitimate. Far worse than this was done to our own prisoners of war over in Vietnam and in other situations. But you'd have some other sides, some ABCs, some CBSs, some MSNBCs saying, This is horrific. This breaks Geneva Convention. And this is totally wrong. I think what you have to recognize right away, crew, is to be a good communicator, you first of all have to learn to sift through the information just by nature of who is presenting it. Because who presents it, that will impact what they present, what they show you, what they choose to keep out. And you need to learn to be wise in that respect. All right, so some important considerations that I want you to write down about communication. Number one, recognize that different audiences and situations require different communication strategies. Again, different audiences and situations require different communication strategies. That's obviously very true for any kind of, I'm going to use politics a lot because I think it's really easy to just sink our teeth into that and do some understanding. But if you've got someone who's running for some kind of a congressional seat and they are going to be doing a presentation to a group of AARP senior citizens, how they communicate with those individuals might be, should be, very different than if they're going to go then down to a factory and they're in and among, healthy people, because the senior citizens are probably very concerned about healthcare issues, right? Medicare, Medicaid. Whereas the factory workers might be more concerned about jobs. And are their jobs from the factory going to be going to another country? Are they going to be losing their jobs? So a wise communicator recognizes that different audiences and different require different communication strategies. But the second thing to consider is that people are aware of this fact, meaning the differences in communications, to varying degrees. You'll watch some people, regardless of the age, regardless of the gender, regardless of the educational background of their audiences, they just have a cookie cutter speech that they give. And because they are not really aware of the fact that different audiences require different strategies. Let me give you another example. If I'm to talk to the teenagers in my church about the wealth of Job, for example, I'm going to explain that to them in a very different way than I'm going to explain that if I'm dealing with 2 and 3-year-olds. 2 and 3-year-olds don't really understand wealth. They really don't understand losing a lot and being bankrupt. Those are very different terms. Third thing I want you to recognize, though, is that an effective communicator is very, very aware of using communication strategies differently. He's very aware of that. He or she behaves accordingly. And I do hope that that is one thing you learn in the course of the semester. We don't just want you learning skills, okay? A lot of people can learn skills, but we want you to learn skills plus the theories behind those skills so that you can go out and be the best communicator that you possibly can be. Fourth thing, effective communicators are highly valued. Really are. Effective communicators are highly valued, which is one key reason why when there are interviews, part of one of the final processes is that face-to-face. They want to see you. They want to know how you can communicate. Oftentimes now it's not enough that you can accomplish it. They want to hire, for example, if they're going to hire someone to the managerial position, they need to know that that person can explain things well and can be a good encourager and can run meetings, okay? Effective communicators are highly valued. So let me ask you this. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? You cannot not communicate. You cannot not communicate. Do you agree with that? Now, this is often very interesting when it comes to the genders, and I've done all kinds of studies on differences in gender communication. It's absolutely fascinating because then what you get into oftentimes is the intentionality debate. For example, you've got a couple girls walking down the hallway, and one girl is walking this way and one girl's coming at her this way, and they pass in the hallway, and the one says hi and the other doesn't say a thing. And the one who says hi might think, oh, is she mad at me? Did I do something wrong? Have I done something to bother her? Does she have something on her mind? And really, there was nothing intended there. Perhaps girl number two simply had a lot on her mind. She'd just come out of a test and she was thinking through, did I get number 16 right or not? I can't remember. Whereas guys, if guys walk by each other and they don't say anything, typically speaking, those guys don't think anything of it. They can shrug shoulders, they can kind of give a little nod, and they're good to go. But recognize that you cannot not communicate, even if it's unintentional. Sometimes people say, well, I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. Well, even your silence communicated something. Your unwillingness to communicate communicated something. We just have to be very, very wise. Even if we're not intending to send out a signal, there's probably somebody watching us. They are watching us, they are analyzing us, and they are getting an impression of us. So I would contend we are always communicating something, even if it wasn't intended. So we just need to learn to be very wise communicators. Another example. During the 2008 presidential debate, we had our two candidates here. The presidential candidate at the time was Barack Obama, now President Obama, and John McCain. Now, at the very end, this is a shot from at the closure of the debate, where obviously they shook each other's hands. Seconds later, cameras were still clicking, and John McCain forgot about that. Again, what's the intentionality debate? Did I really mean to communicate this? But this was a picture that was taken just seconds later, and this was all over the internet, all over the newspapers, all over the magazines. What was he attempting to communicate? I don't know. But that one little snapshot, what would go through your mind if you had seen it? What would you think about that candidate? See, we are always communicating something. So let's keep going, and we're going to talk about models of communication. Now, first of all, what is a model? Because communication theorists create models. We've got model airplanes, we've got model trains, we've got the miniatures, right? We look at how something works, how it functions. That's what we want to think of when we're dealing with models. Now, first of all, go ahead and write this down, please. That a model is a simplified representation of complex interrelationships. Okay, so it's simplified. It's a simple version of a very complex interrelationship among elements of communication processes that allow us to visually understand a sometimes complex process. Now, let me say this. If there's ever a time I'm giving notes and I get going a little too quickly, the classroom might be able to watch your feedback, and I can't watch your feedback on the computer. So if there's ever a time that I give some kind of some notes that you didn't catch, I would encourage you to just stop the video, just hit pause long enough to write down that definition, because you will see things like this on quizzes and on final exams. Okay, so I want to make sure you get these notes down. So if you need to stop this and rewrite it or write it so that you're not rushed, that's just fine. But again, a model is a simplified representation of a complex interrelationship among elements of communication processes that allow us to visually understand a complex process. Because communication is always going on around us, right? And so how can we put that into a visual picture that we can understand? Well, that's what communication theorists do. We're going to deal with 3 of those today, okay? First of all, we're going to look at the linear model. Now, what I would like you to do, please, is go ahead and write down these bullets, and then we'll draw it out, because that's what communication modeling is all about, just putting that complex situation into a simple form. Okay? So the linear model has the source. Now, the source is the means or the person who is giving the information. All right? So right now, I am the source. Okay? But the source could be your brother, the source could be your mother, the source could be your boss, whoever's getting this information out. Then you have the message itself. What is the message? For this class period, the message is communication models. We'll have a different message when we have another theory discussion. The receiver is simply the recipient. You today are the recipient of this message. In a classroom situation, I have different receivers, right? I've got the students seated in front of me. The channel is the means by which this message is given. For example, if you're watching the television, then the TV is your medium, M-E-D-I-U-M, your means by which it's dispersed. If you're on the internet and you're, doing some research there, the internet is your channel. If you're on the telephone, you're text messaging someone, that is your channel, okay? Lots of channels. We can have a channel that's in print if we're reading the newspaper or reading a book. We've got a Kindle in our hands. Well, that's our channel. Then the last thing you have with this linear model is the noise. And I need you to understand that noise can be physical and it can be psychological, okay? Just let me quickly go through this because all of our models are going to have noise. Physical noise is that which is out there that I can hear. If there's a fire engine that goes rumbling by and it's just screaming with sirens, that is a distraction. That's a noise, okay? We call those noises anything that's going to impede the process of this message going through to you. You could also have, physical noise of if suddenly the air conditioning were to kick on and it just would kind of bang and crank, or if there were a car accident outside and we heard all that metal to metal, that would be awful. The psychological noise is the internal noise, the noise which the recipient has. For example, if you're worried about a test coming up, or you're concerned about a game later on in the day, or perhaps you're just wondering about if you're going to be able to pay all your bills on time, right? So noise is that which can disrupt the process of communication. Now, I want you to go ahead and draw this for me. Linear, think of the word line. So what's going to happen? Well, we've got our sender. We've got our source. Again, what I'll do is I'll talk through this particular PowerPoint slide, and then if you need to just listen, and then when I get done, you could stop it and then draw it. That might help you, okay? Then your sender gives a message. If I am the sender, I'm the teacher, and I'm giving you the message. I'm just trying to teach you something today. You then are my target receiver. I'm going to do everything I can to help you understand. But the dilemma that happens is that noise. Remember? The noise that can come in there. Semantic noise if you don't understand the words I'm using. If we're trying to deal with third graders, sometimes we use words that are just way too big for them. And they get frustrated. And so then that's that internal noise. They say, I don't understand what they're saying. And sometimes they'll just give up. And you've got your physical and your psychological and your physiological noise. Perhaps your knee is hurting. Those are all noises that can stop the message. But as you look at this, do you see how it's really a straight line? So this was a simplified linear model of communication. If you need to stop this and draw it, this would be a good time to do that. But I'm going to keep going, okay? But the linear model, notice what happens. It's really one way. You've got your information, message, and then your receiver. And early on, there were people who said, you know what, if I say it, I have communicated. But theorists began to look at that and said, I don't think so. Just because I tell my teenager something, that doesn't mean that he heard it. That doesn't mean he was even listening. I would contend that communication, I need to say something that he understands, right? So they said, all right, we're going to create the interactive model. So again, write these bullets down for me. That's where you've got listeners responding to the feedback, responding to the speaker, making a key difference here, the feedback. You've also, in the interactive model, added personal fields of experience. Now, and limitations. How much of those fields of experiences are actually shared? All right, so let's talk through these just real quickly, okay? First of all, feedback is key on the interactive model. So if I'm trying to tell my son that I just don't think his room is very clean, and his response is a really scrunched, crinkled face, I think, either he doesn't understand me or he disagrees. In his mind, his room is clean. Personal fields of experience. I have experienced things in my life that perhaps you have not experienced, but our experiences shape us, do they not? Anybody who's been through war understands that war really shapes a person. Anybody who's been through a situation where perhaps they had a job and lost it, that is an experience, a field of experience. But again, with the interactive model, perhaps the limitation is, was there any crossover? Now let me show you what I mean here. So we're going to draw this very differently. Why? Because of the feedback. That is crucial. So notice if you start at kind of the bottom, you've got your message. Then you got the field of experience of the source. Okay, so my fields of experience might include that I grew up in a family with 8 children. Okay, that's my field of experience. My target audience is I'm going to try to talk maybe to some future parents, right? But they have their fields of experience as we work our way around this circle. And what if I'm talking to somebody who was an only child? Do you understand? We both have fields of experience of childhood, but they're very different in the sense that I came from a family with 8 kids. They perhaps came from a family of 1 child. Things were a little bit different. So that listener provides feedback, which may then somewhat cause me to alter my message just a little bit. Not always, not always. Wisconsin recently passed that it is illegal to text and drive. That has put some teenagers and some adults, for a matter of fact, up in arms. They're very frustrated. It doesn't matter. I should be able to text and drive. I think I'm fine. But the research is starting to show that if you text and drive, you actually change your ability to respond rapidly in a driving situation, either to brake quickly or to turn to try to avoid. But people, they slow down reaction time to that of a 70-year-old. And still there are people saying, I don't care, I should be able to text and drive. Well, what if my field of experience, do you remember this picture? This was from the train driver who was texting, didn't see what was coming, and caused this horrible accident, and the train driver lost his life as well as several of the passengers. Now, if I had had a family member on that train, my field of experience in that situation might be so strong that you're going to have a hard time trying to convince me that people should not text and drive if your field of experience is just that you've been able to text and you've never had an audience. Okay, that's the interactive model. We've added feedback, very, very, very important. We've also added fields of experience. Okay, now let's move on to the final one, which has really been embraced as the best, okay? The best transaction model. So let's go through here. What are they saying? They say, you know what? It's not just a communication that's kind of in that circle where the receiver sends and then he kind of waits for the feedback. But transaction model, it's going both ways. It's energetic all the time. It's the simultaneous sending and receiving of messages. It's cooperative. Hopefully, you want to listen, you want to learn, so you're paying attention to what you're hearing. It is influenced by past experience, so we do have those shared fields of experience. But now I've included both verbal and nonverbal. We'll spend time on nonverbal a few lectures down the road, but nonverbal is really that communication which occurs not necessarily with words, okay? It can be through gestures. It can be through the pitch and the tone and the volume. Those are all nonverbals included in transaction. Meanings are negotiated and contextual. You say, Mrs. Morris, boy, you lost me there, negotiated. All right, let's go back to the example of my son and his room. Now, remember I said to him, son, you need to clean your room. That crinkled look. Why? Because we have to negotiate, not sitting down with paper, negotiate like in hostages, but he has to come to a clear understanding of what my meaning of clean is. You understand? Meanings are negotiated, because if I say I want it cleaned, he doesn't understand my meaning. Well, that could simply mean that he throws all his clothes into his closet, closes the closet door, and says, well, see, Mom, there's nothing on the floor of my room. Okay? I would have to say to him, no, 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 clean means your closets are organized, everything's off the floor of your room, and it passes my standard of clean, not just your standard of clean. Okay? And they're contextual. A lot of times meanings are based on what is the situation that's going on at hand. So here's how our transaction model is going to work. For trans means across, so we're going to think of this as just a constant, fluid situation. This field of experience, we have a shared field. We really search to try to get that shared experience. I'm giving my message, the audience is giving me feedback, and I've got the noise going on, because you always have noise. You rarely, if ever, going to have a communication situation where there's no noise, right? But this is all going on at once. It's just this enormous situation, which is very challenging then to try to communicate well, which is what makes very good communicators very needed in America. We need them. All right, so what are some aspects of mass comm? I need you to remember it's part skill, part art, and part science. Okay, mass comm, when we're trying to deal with more than just a one-on-one conversation. Mass comm is part skill, part art, and part science. Now, what do I mean there? Well, it's part skill. Why? Because it involves certain fundamental learnable techniques, okay, skills. Focusing a television camera. We'll have you make a video for us. Or operating an iPod, or building a website, or running advertising. Those are skills. Perhaps you already have some of those. Good for you. Bravo. We'll try to help you enhance them. Perhaps you know how to build a website, and we'll try to give you even stronger things to recognize and know, okay? But those are skills. Skills oftentimes are learned. Next, it's part art because it involves creative challenges, such as writing a script for a documentary, or developing a pleasing and eye-catching layout for an advertisement, or coming up with catchy, hard-hitting leads for a news story, okay? If you think of art as that which catches the eyes and the ears, that takes time. Have you ever been to a website that was just so boring you didn't even want to return? They may have completely understood the skill of putting it together. They did not do well with the art, and so you were turned away. Finally, it's part science, because there are going to be certain things we teach you that are verifiable. Okay? There are principles involved in making communication work that will help you achieve specific goals. We'll teach you some aspects, and again, this is just kind of a real quick overview class, but we will teach you some scientific aspects of nonverbal communication. We'll teach you some scientific aspects of the scientific method as it relates to nonverbal communication. We'll teach you the science of mass media, okay? All those things. But you see, it's when we can intertwine the skill and the art and the science, when we can get all three of those, wow, effective communication occurs. That's what we need you to do. That's what we need for the cause of Christ, is it not? We have the most glorious message in the world. We got to be able to get that across, don't we? So, 8 miscommunications, and we'll be done. You've done a fantastic job today. Thanks for staying with me. So these are things that people do incorrectly, or they believe incorrectly, alrighty? First of all, they believe oftentimes that meanings are limited to words. Not true. Not true. Have you ever been talking to somebody and they say, well, I didn't say that? Sometimes it's not what they said, it's how they say it. Right? What if my husband comes home from work and I say, how was your day? And he says, it was great. It was great. 3 words. I believe him. But what if he comes home from work and I say, how was your day? And he says, yeah, it was great. Same words, right? Completely different message. So meanings are not simply limited to words. That's a miscommunication. Can't wait. A misconception is that communication is only verbal. I think even as we progress into the technological realm, we see that more and more. But again, focusing on the nonverbal, how I say it or how I present it. If I go too fast, if I go too slowly, all those things can impact the effectiveness of my message. Third, telling is communicating. That is just not true. Parents need to grab a hold of that, but so do teachers. I think I've been teaching for 20 years now, and I look back at my first year and think, oh boy, I do think I followed the misconception that, hey, I talked at them in class, therefore I had communicated. You know what? Talking at somebody is far different than talking to somebody. Next, communication will solve all our problems. Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But that is a misconception. Communication will not solve all our problems. Because if all it took were sitting down and talking, we would never have war again. We would never have disagreements between countries. We would never have fights. Okay? Communication alone is not going to solve our problems. It can be very helpful in solving a problem, but it is not the end all. Next, communication is always a good thing. You know what? Communication isn't always good. If I'm cruel, if I'm biting, if I don't follow, proper procedure, communication can be very, very damaging. So sometimes it's better to just not open my mouth, right? It's better to think things through. I think, gentlemen, you might agree with this. The more communication, the better. As a female, I'm often told, you could say it. You could say less. My two of my daughters were recently gone, and so it was my son and my husband, and we were all in the house, and my son said, "Wow, isn't it quiet?" Because two of the three girls were gone. Okay, the more communication is not the better. Some people think if they are just verbose and they go on and on and on and on and use lots of large words, large polysyllabic words, that people will think they're intelligent. No, some people might just think they're annoying. Next, there's a misconception that communication can break down. You say, well, yeah, I've heard that, Mrs. Morris, that we had a communication breakdown. Technically, the communication process does not break down. Somewhere along the line, the humans involved blew it. Perhaps I didn't give enough. Perhaps I wasn't patient enough. Perhaps my listener didn't try hard enough. In other words, communication is going on. And when I stop talking to that other person, I have communicated something. So it's not the communication that breaks down as much as the people that just hit that juggernaut. And finally, too many people think, well, they are just good at communicating because it comes naturally. Now, I think it is true that some people, it is easier for them to get up front. But communication is ever a skill that can be honed and can be learned and can be worked upon. One of the greatest communicators was Winston Churchill, who motivated his country to not give up during World War II. But did you know that oftentimes Winston Churchill would actually memorize his speeches? He was so afraid he'd mess up that there's been those who suggest he might have actually had some dyslexia. Not very sure about that. But one thing we do know is that he memorized a lot of his speeches, but he actually put in their ums and ahs and ers. So he'd be talking along, and then he'd kind of stop and continue on. And he did that so it appeared as if he were thinking off the top of his head instead of giving a scripted speech. Now that is sheer skill and ability that was not necessarily natural ability, but ability that was worked on. Okay? So remember, different forms of communication we'll be talking about, but understand that communication is a two-way process, and if we really want communication to work, we have to work hard at it. All right, it's been great to be with you today. If you missed anything, go back, go through, rewind, and make sure that you've got all your notes in place, okay? Listen, have a good and godly day. For of what lasting value is a good day if it's not also godly? We'll see you.